It had been hours of hiking through the dry, desolate expanse of Sierra Ravine when the terrain shifted, marking the beginning of an adventure that nearly ended my life. The trail had long since disappeared behind me, swallowed by the sprawling desert landscape, and I had found myself far from the usual paths others tread. This was the place I'd always dreamed of exploring, a vast, untouched wilderness where nothing existed but me and the land. Except, it wasn't exactly as I had imagined. The ravine was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was eerie. The wind whistled through the cracks in the rocks, creating strange whispers that only added to the sense of isolation. The soil here was an intense shade of reddish-brown, rich with clay and dust, as if the land itself had been frozen in time. There were caves everywhere, natural openings in the earth's surface that seemed inviting, beckoning me to come closer. I had been warned that Sierra Ravine was a place for experienced explorers, but I figured I was seasoned enough to handle anything the canyon could throw at me. I'd spent years exploring caves, hiking, and getting to know wild places, but nothing had prepared me for what happened that day. I was following a narrow, uneven path, the kind where every step you take could lead to an unexpected drop. My heavy backpack, loaded with supplies, maps, and my camera gear, was starting to make me feel clumsy. It hung on my shoulders, pulling me backward with every shift in my movements. But the allure of the ravine, with its jagged cliffs and cavernous secrets, kept me moving forward. That's when it happened. One second, the ground was solid beneath me, and the next it wasn't. Without warning, the earth cracked open beneath my feet. It wasn't a sharp crack like a tree branch snapping, but a slow, almost imperceptible slide as the loose red clay gave way. One moment, I was standing on solid ground, and the next, I was falling. I don't know how far I fell, maybe 10 feet, maybe more, but the sensation of sliding was like nothing I had ever experienced. The loose clay gave way beneath me, slipping from underfoot, dragging me further into the chute. I couldn't stop myself. My heart was racing as I plunged downward, desperately trying to grab onto something, anything, but there was nothing to hold onto. The walls of the chute were too smooth, too slick, the kind of smoothness that only clay and dry earth can create. My fingers clawed at the walls in vain, my body picking up speed, my mind reeling in panic. Then, just as quickly as the slide began, I stopped. My backpack, which had been pulling me backward with each step, had wedged itself between the narrow walls of the chute. The pressure was suffocating, and I found myself stuck, my body pinned between the rocks. I was trapped. The weight of the pack, along with the slickness of the clay, kept me in place. I could feel the panic rising again. The fear of not knowing how deep this hole went, how far I might slide if the pack gave way, was almost overwhelming. The walls of the chute felt like they were closing in on me, and the silence of the ravine was deafening. I knew I was far off the trail, far from any sign of civilization, and the thought that I might not be found made my stomach twist. I had to stay calm. Taking a deep breath, I checked my body. Nothing seemed broken, but I could feel the strain in my arms and legs from trying to hold myself in place. My fingers were numb from gripping the walls of the chute, but I knew I had to move. There was no other choice. If I stayed here too long, the risk of sliding further down into the ravine would only grow. Using all my strength, I wiggled my body as best as I could, shifting my weight to get a little more leverage. It took all the energy I had, but slowly, I was able to inch myself up. Every time I moved, the pack pushed me back down, forcing me to start over. The earth felt like it was alive, constantly shifting beneath me, as if it wanted to swallow me whole. I finally managed to shimmy upwards, using my feet and legs to push against the walls of the chute. My hands, covered in the dry, gritty clay, left a trail of white dust as I dragged myself upward. My heart was pounding in my chest, and sweat poured down my face, though the air was dry and hot. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up, but I pushed through the fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke free. The pack shifted one last time, and I scrambled upward, flinging myself out of the chute and onto solid ground. My legs were trembling, my chest heaving for breath. I lay there for a few moments, my back pressed against the rough rock, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. I had made it out. I had survived. But that wasn't the end of the story. Oh no. I had to get back to camp. And that's when the full realization hit me. I had no idea where I was. I had wandered far from the trail, and now I was lost. My mind raced as I tried to retrace my steps. I'd crossed the dry stream bed a few miles back, and I could remember the towering rock formations I'd passed earlier. But when I turned around and looked, nothing seemed familiar. The landscape stretched out before me, identical in every direction, a vast, unbroken desert of clay and rocks. The ravine had swallowed me whole. It was as though the earth had shifted while I wasn't looking, rearranging itself to leave me behind. I spent what felt like hours wandering, searching for any landmark, anything that could guide me back to where I had started. But the more I looked, the more I realized how far I had gone off the beaten path. The area was too vast, the land too unyielding, and the sun was setting. I didn't even know which direction to go anymore. Eventually, I stumbled back into camp, exhausted and disoriented. I needed to sit, to breathe, to regroup. But even as I sat there, my mind couldn't stop racing. The terror of the slide still lingered, its grip on me tight and unforgiving. And the thought that I might never have been found, that I could have spent days lost in Sierra Ravine, haunted me. The next day, after getting some rest, I tried to return to the place where the chute had given way, to show my wife the spot. I had a vague memory of where it had been, a sense of the terrain, but I couldn't find it again. Despite my best efforts, the chute had vanished into the vastness of the canyon, swallowed by the very earth I had thought I knew so well. The land had shifted, and I was no longer sure of where I had been. That was the part that terrified me the most. In Sierra Ravine, nothing stays the same for long. The earth moves, the ground gives way, and the land can swallow you whole if you're not careful. What seemed like a simple exploration turned into a lesson in humility, a reminder of how small I am in the face of nature's power. It was a wake-up call, and though I love exploring caves, this experience taught me that the wild has its own rules, ones I can't predict. Sierra Ravine had given me a glimpse of its unforgiving nature, and I would never take it lightly again. The sun was sinking low, casting long, jagged shadows across the Utah wilderness. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks and makes you pull your jacket tighter. My best friend Jason and I had spent the day hiking through the rugged terrain, our boots crunching against the dry earth. My dog Rex, a sturdy German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt amber, trotted ahead of us, his ears perked and tail wagging as he sniffed at the occasional bush or rock. He was always eager to explore, but tonight even he seemed restless, his movements quicker, his eyes darting more frequently into the shadows. "We should pick up the pace," Jason said, his voice low. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. "It's getting dark faster than I thought." I nodded, feeling a knot of unease tighten in my stomach. The trail back to the car was about 2 miles, and the last thing I wanted was to be caught out here after nightfall. The wilderness was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. The thought of navigating these rocky paths in the dark made my skin crawl. We quickened our steps, the sound of our boots and Rex's paws echoing in the stillness. The forest around us seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. Even the birds had stopped their chirping, leaving only the rustle of leaves in the wind. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following us, but there was nothing. Just the empty trail and the deepening shadows. Rex stopped suddenly, his body rigid, his ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. I froze, my heart pounding. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, crouching down to place a hand on his back. His muscles were tense, his fur bristling. Jason stopped beside me, his eyes narrowing as he followed Rex's gaze. "Something's out there," he said quietly. I strained my ears, listening for any sound that might give away what had spooked Rex. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling in the underbrush. It was coming from the trees to our left, just off the trail. "Let's keep moving," Jason said, his voice tight. "Don't run, just walk." We started forward again, but Rex refused to budge. He stood his ground, his growl growing louder. I tugged gently on his leash, but he didn't respond. My pulse quickened. Rex wasn't the type to disobey, especially not in situations like this. The rustling grew louder, closer. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on us, watching, waiting. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, and my grip on Rex's leash tightened. Then, without warning, a figure burst from the trees. It was a bobcat, its tawny fur streaked with shadows, its eyes glowing like embers in the fading light. It moved with a fluid, predatory grace, its muscles coiled and ready to strike. Rex lunged forward, barking furiously, but I held him back, my heart racing. "Stay calm," Jason said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Don't turn your back, just back away slowly." We began to retreat, our eyes locked on the bobcat. It crouched low, its tail twitching, its gaze never leaving us. I could see the tension in its body, the way its claws dug into the dirt. It was sizing us up, deciding whether we were worth the fight. Rex's barking grew more frantic, and I could feel the strain on the leash as he pulled against me. The bobcat's ears flattened, and it let out a low, guttural snarl. My stomach churned. I had never been this close to a wild predator before, and the raw, primal fear it evoked was overwhelming. "Keep moving," Jason urged, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make any sudden moves." We continued to back away, step by agonizing step. The bobcat followed, its movements deliberate, its eyes never wavering. It was toying with us, testing our resolve. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my hands trembling as I gripped Rex's leash. Then, without warning, the bobcat lunged. It moved faster than I thought possible, a blur of fur and claws. Rex broke free from my grip, charging forward to meet the attack. The two animals collided with a sickening thud, their snarls and growls filling the air. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Rex!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. Jason grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We have to help him," I cried, struggling against his grip. "We can't." Jason snapped, his eyes wide with fear. "We'll just get in the way." I watched in horror as Rex and the bobcat tumbled across the ground, locked in a vicious struggle. Rex was strong, but the bobcat was faster, its claws slashing through the air. I could see the blood on Rex's fur, the way his movements were becoming more labored. "We have to do something," I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. Jason hesitated, then reached down and grabbed a large rock from the ground. "Stay back," he said, his voice firm. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The bobcat's attention shifted to him, its eyes narrowing. Jason raised the rock, his arm trembling. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. The bobcat hesitated, its gaze flicking between Jason and Rex. For a moment, it seemed to consider its options. Then, with a final snarl, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. I rushed to Rex's side, dropping to my knees beside him. He was panting heavily, his body covered in scratches and bites. His eyes met mine, and I could see the pain and fear in them. "We need to get him to a vet," Jason said, his voice urgent. "Now." I nodded, my hands shaking as I gently lifted Rex into my arms. He whimpered softly, but didn't resist. Jason grabbed our backpacks, and we started down the trail as fast as we could. The sun had set completely now, and the forest was plunged into darkness. The only light came from Jason's flashlight, its beam cutting through the blackness like a knife. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made my heart skip a beat. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the bobcat, or something worse, was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. We reached the car just as the first stars began to appear in the sky. I carefully laid Rex in the back seat, his breathing shallow and labored. Jason climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Hold on, buddy," I whispered, stroking Rex's head. "We're going to get you help." The drive to the nearest town was a blur. My mind raced with thoughts of what could have happened, what still might happen. The image of the bobcat's glowing eyes haunted me, its snarl echoing in my ears. When we finally reached the vet, they took Rex in immediately. Jason and I waited in the lobby, our clothes stained with dirt and blood, our faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Hours passed before the vet finally emerged. "He's going to be okay," she said, her voice gentle. "He's got some stitches and a few broken ribs, but he's a tough dog. He'll pull through." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. The memory of the bobcat's attack lingered, a dark cloud over my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been lucky, too lucky. As we drove back to the trailhead to retrieve our gear, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. The wilderness was beautiful, but it was also dangerous, and as much as I loved it, I knew I would never look at it the same way again. The shadows on the trail seemed darker now, the silence more ominous. And as we packed up our things and headed home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of what lurked in the wild. The bobcat was gone, but the fear it had left behind would stay with me forever. The sun was high, casting dappled light through the dense canopy of pine trees. I was hiking alone, as I often did, on a trail just outside the small town of Pinecrest, Montana. My two dogs, Max and Bella, trotted ahead of me, their tails wagging as they sniffed the ground and darted between the trees. It was a perfect day, warm but not too hot, the kind of weather that made you feel alive. I had no idea how quickly that feeling would change. I'd been on this trail dozens of times before. It was my escape, my sanctuary. The forest was quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I was lost in thought, thinking about work, life, and the endless to-do list waiting for me back home. That's when it happened. The next thing I knew, there was a bear 6 feet in front of me. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The bear, a grizzly, was massive, her fur a deep brown that shimmered in the sunlight. She was standing on all fours, her shoulders hunched, her eyes locked on mine. For a split second, time seemed to stop. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, and the distant sound of Max and Bella barking somewhere behind me. Then she charged. She came at me fast, her powerful legs propelling her forward in a blur of muscle and fur. I didn't have time to think. Instinct took over. I raised my fists, my mind screaming at me to fight. I'd heard stories about people surviving bear attacks by standing their ground, and I wasn't about to go down without a fight. She was on me in seconds. I swung my fist and connected with her snout. The impact sent a jolt of pain through my hand, but I didn't stop. I hit her again and again, my knuckles scraping against her rough fur. She roared, a deep, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. I could feel her hot breath on my face, smell the earthy scent of her fur. She was so close, so terrifyingly close. I don't know how many times I hit her, 3, maybe 4. It was a desperate, frantic struggle. But then she was on top of me, her weight crushing me into the ground. I dropped into a ball, tucking my head and covering my neck with my arms. It was the only thing I could think to do, but in doing so, I left my head exposed. I felt her claws rake across my scalp, sharp and searing. The pain was immediate, blinding. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest. I could feel blood running down my face, warm and sticky. I thought, this is it. This is how I die. But then, out of nowhere, Max and Bella were there. They lunged at the bear, barking and snapping at her. I heard her roar again, this time in frustration or pain, I couldn't tell. The weight on top of me lifted, and I dared to open my eyes. The bear was gone, disappearing into the trees with my dogs hot on her heels. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my body trembling, my head throbbing. I could hear Max and Bella barking in the distance, but they soon returned, panting and wagging their tails as if nothing had happened. I wanted to hug them, to thank them for saving my life, but I couldn't move. My hands were shaking. My legs felt like jelly, and my head was a mess of blood and dirt. Somehow, I managed to get to my feet. I stumbled back down the trail, calling for Max and Bella to follow. Every step was agony, but I knew I had to keep moving. I had to get help. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I collapsed. A family hiking nearby saw me and rushed to my aid. They called 911, and within minutes, the local first responders arrived. I remember bits and pieces of what happened next. The paramedics cleaning my wounds, the sound of the helicopter as it landed to airlift me to St. Mary's Hospital in Helena. I was in shock, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. At the hospital, the doctors stitched me up, 13 staples in my head to close the wounds from the bear's claws. They told me I was lucky. Lucky that the attack had been brief. Lucky that my dogs had intervened. Lucky that I hadn't been more seriously injured. I nodded, but the word lucky didn't feel right. I didn't feel lucky. I felt shaken, traumatized, and guilty. Guilty because I knew I'd put the bear in a terrible position. I'd read the warnings from the Montana Department of Fish and Wildlife: how to identify yourself as human, how to back away slowly, how to carry bear spray. But I hadn't been prepared. I hadn't been paying attention. And because of that, the bear had been forced to defend herself. Now, because of me, she was in danger. The department had sent a team to search for her, to track her down, and I couldn't bear to think about it. I didn't want her to be killed because of my mistake. I kept replaying the attack in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently. If I'd had bear spray, if I'd made more noise, if I'd stayed on a more populated trail. The what-ifs haunted me. A few days later, I got a call from the department. They told me they'd mistakenly killed a male bear, not the one that had attacked me. The search had been called off due to the heat, and the female bear was still out there, somewhere in the forest. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief that she was alive, but unease because I knew she was still out there, possibly still a threat. As I recovered at home, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I wondered if she had cubs, if she'd been protecting them when she charged me. I wondered if she was as scared of me as I was of her. I felt a strange connection to her, as if we were both survivors of a terrible misunderstanding. My dogs never left my side during those first few days. Max would curl up next to me on the couch, his head resting on my lap, while Bella kept watch by the window. They were my heroes, my protectors. I owed them my life. The physical wounds healed quickly, but the emotional scars took longer. I had nightmares about the attack, waking up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I was jumpy, flinching at every sound. I avoided the forest for weeks, too afraid to go back. But eventually I realized I couldn't let fear control me. The forest was my sanctuary, and I wasn't ready to give it up. I started small, walking on well-populated trails during the busiest times of day. I carried bear spray and a whistle, and I made sure to make plenty of noise as I hiked. I was cautious, but I refused to let the attack take away something I loved. Over time, the fear began to fade. I still thought about the bear, but the memories no longer paralyzed me. Instead, they reminded me of the fragility of life, the importance of being present, and the power of instinct. I'd survived because I'd fought back, because my dogs had intervened, and because in the end, the bear had chosen to leave. I don't know if I'll ever see her again. Part of me hopes I do, just to know she's okay. But part of me hopes I never do. Some things are better left in the past. For now, I'm just grateful. For my dogs, for the first responders, for the doctors who patched me up, and even for the bear. She taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Respect the wild, because it doesn't belong to us. We're just visitors, and we need to tread carefully. As I sit here now, looking out at the forest from my porch, I feel a sense of peace. The trees are still, the air is calm, and the world feels right again. I know I'll never forget that day, but I also know I'm stronger because of it. And next time, if there is a next time, I'll be ready.